Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast which explains why Indigenous partnerships are the key to securing successful outcomes in natural resource and infrastructure investment in Canada. I'm Mark Magnacca, and my co-host Rob Brant and I are here today to discuss Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's first budget as he sets a new direction for the country. And what a direction it is. This budget signals something we've been talking about on Drumbeats for months now. Indigenous partnerships are no longer on the periphery of Canada's economic strategy. They're central to it. Carney's laid out specific mechanisms, legislative changes, and funding programs that embed Indigenous participation into Canada's investment future. In this conversation, you'll discover three game-changing Indigenous economic initiatives, how the First Nations Finance Authority is now working to be able to use special purpose vehicles, why new bonding programs open defense procurement to Indigenous contractors, and how First Nations can monetize future revenues for immediate capital investments. We'll also explore why Canada's fiscal position gives it competitive advantages against nearly all G7 countries, and that investors in the UK and continental Europe should certainly take notice of. The opportunity is clear. Canada needs over $1 trillion in private capital over the next 5 years, and the pathways for Indigenous partnerships are now being systematically built into policy. Join us as we discuss Prime Minister Mark Carney's first budget. So here we are, the morning after the night before. Rob Brant.
Good morning, Mark.
Great to be here.
Nice to see you bright and early. I'm coming to you from beautiful Tsuut'ina Nation, Treaty 7 territory, just outside of Calgary this morning. It's a very early morning, bright start, but it's an important topic.
Yes, it is, and it's great to have a Western perspective on Prime Minister Mark Carney's first budget as he sets a new direction for the country.
And it is a new direction. I mean, there's a lot of detail in there. We are just hours from the budget being released, but there's some really interesting initiatives that that Indigenous people will find encouraging. There's also a little bit of pain in that budget too. So
let's unpack it. So it's not the budget anyone's expected from the most recent Liberal governments we have. I'm sure there's many members of the Conservatives, or what was partly the Progressive Conservatives before they allied with Reform, who would think, okay, maybe there's some things that have been addressed correctly. But maybe we should have seen it with Mark Carney. One of the reasons he got elected is he knows how to run a business. He knows how to run big organizations. And on one hand, we're seeing massive infrastructure spending proposed, and on the other hand, they're cutting tens of thousands of public service jobs. And this unusual combination of austerity and ambition that they had talked about before was going to happen, but it's kind of new for Canadians because they haven't used to being seeing something like this for many, many years. Now, they still need the votes to pass it for our listeners, certainly over in the UK. Carney leads a minority government. He must have been a very happy man yesterday because he needs three more MPs to have a majority government. And there was a Conservative member from the Maritimes who switched before the session yesterday. So now there's only two. And again, there's, I think, 7 NDP members, the New Democratic, the Socialist Party of Canada, and maybe they'll abstain. But I think we're in an interesting time. There'll be a confidence vote later. We can talk about that. But let's talk about what's going on.
Yeah, because there was a big build up to this budget. If you recall, it was postponed from the spring, right after the federal election. And so we've been waiting for some time. And there's been a lot of rhetoric about generational change. I'm not sure there is as big a change some people wanted to see in this first budget, but I think there's only so much you can do um, in a budget like this. So it's definitely a pivot from recent budget focuses, and like I said, some really interesting Indigenous initiatives.
Great. I think, though, from a historical perspective, when Prime Minister Jean Chrétien and his finance minister, who were also liberals, they came in, which was a completely radical budget, challenging times for Canada way back when that was, and really took the bull by the horns. So for myself, I'm a little bit surprised that perhaps it wasn't as transformative as one could expect. But that comes back into this issue: is Canada in good shape or bad shape? And just before we get into some of the details, let me quote some of the headlines from the newspapers. Since we're on a UK-based podcast here, we're going to talk about newspaper headlines.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Which is a great tradition over here.
Absolutely.
So Global Mail is Canada's national newspaper. Some can dispute that, but let's go with that. Carney earmarks billions in new spending to counter U.S. protectionism. The opinion analysis section, we had Andrew Coyne of the Globe Mail saying, after all the hype, the budget fails to meet the moment. Shannon Proudfoot, Carney's budget is a manifesto of no. Campbell Clark, when the big day came, it wasn't quite as advertised. And Adam Rawonsky said, budget signals Carney's new tone on climate, but little substance. So not exactly overwhelming, wow, this was what Canada needed. The Financial Times has Canada's Mark Carney pledges 141 billion Canadian to counter Donald Trump's trade war, giving an interesting perspective for those from the UK. And nothing has shown up in The Economist yet, but the Wall Street Journal says Canada plans wider deficits to jolt the economy to get things going. So a lot of outsiders have been looking at what's going on in Canada to see what is going to be the future.
Yeah, and for me, Mark, one of the interesting parts of this budget, and I saw Goldie Hyder, the head of the Business Council of Canada, comment that some good steps, but not enough, and so business may have been hoping for more. But one of the interesting aspects of it that I saw was the focus on trading partners outside of North America, and the target to double exports outside of North America over the next few years. And there's talk in the budget about needing more reliable partners, which I think is a dig at the U.S., but there's definite outward focus.
So?
A definite outward focus in this budget too, which is nice to see.
Yes, it is. And prior to the budget, when Prime Minister Carney, along with other of the leaders, were in Southeast Asia, and Prime Minister of Canada met with President Xi of China, and it's been a long time since the Canadian Prime Minister has met with him. And Carney had led a North American business delegation, I think, a couple of years ago, but that's kind of given a reset. And China has announced early on that they will increase the number of tourists, group tourism that can go to Canada, which is obviously always a carrot the Chinese government has to say we can direct a lot of consumer spending your way. So I think that was an early sign of warming relationship. And it's been in a deep freeze, right?
For sure. The Saudi investment minister was through Toronto just the other day. And again, that relationship is thawing, and there's trying to encourage foreign investment, talk about infrastructure gaps and the billions of dollars of investment that are needed. And it's pretty clear that Canada alone can't fund that gap, and we're going to need financial partners from all over the world. So yeah, you're seeing a reset in China, Saudi, a new focus on Europe, all culminating, I'm sure, at our summit next April.
Yes, I'm sure. So let's look at where Canada is just before we get into the budget and the impact on the Indigenous nations and what that means for the foundational peoples of Canada. So on a per capita basis, GDP has been declining from 2020 to 24. It's declined 2%. Okay, which according to the Fraser Institute, a well-known institute in Canada, is the worst 5-year performance since the Great Depression. For those of us who are old enough to know, the Great Depression was something our grandparents went through. Okay, so that's a long, long time ago. Average Canadian worker has less machinery and equipment to work with, lower productivity, right? Fewer raw materials, ideas, and inputs being transformed into goods and services. And while the total GDP looks bigger on paper, it's because the population grew so significantly. Like many countries, a lot of immigrants were let in thinking that was a solution or lack of control of borders. Who knows? But now we're dealing with the consequences. And as a result, Canada and Canadians are not generating more economic value per person. And Canada ranks last in G7 per capita GDP growth over this period. So that is really something. And it's interesting being on this side of the pond because, you know, the UK government is also talking, how are we doing against our G7 frenemies? So there's a lot going on that. And when we talk about the low productivity issue, which has been an issue here as well as in Canada, okay, people generate less tax revenue and that affects the deficit, right? So this budget deficit, the headline numbers, 78 billion, it's nearly doubled, whereas the prior year deficit was 62 billion, which was a 77% jump from the prior year. So deficits are accelerating. And why are we having the deficits increase? Revenue loss from scrapping the retaliatory tariffs on the US, expected about 20 billion. Relief measures to tariff industries. Huge increase in defense spending to meet our NATO commitment, which Canada has consistently been a low performer. And it's always been embarrassing. And Rob, I know you've supported the military through your work with veterans for a number of years, but to see Canada always at the bottom, that has been an ongoing concern.
Yeah, and that's one area in this budget where you see clear increase in real spending and investment. Part of it is,
which is great to see.
Yeah. I think it's most people agree it's long overdue, and there's money for new hires, but as well to raise some of the standards of our service men and women, be able to pay higher salaries. But investment in technology, investment in the north, that is a clear focus, and that is partly why you see sustained deficit spending for a while. There's an investment needed.
Great. So you mentioned earlier, Canada has to attract foreign capital. We always have needed it, but more so today. But now Canada has this reputation as being a difficult place to deal with. So now we're going to get into what's going on. Our World Bank Ease of Doing Business rankings, Canada fell from number 4 globally in 2006 to 23rd by 2020. And it's taken 3 to 6 years just for a regulatory review. We had Michael McPhee on last week or a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about 15 years to get a mining project going is kind of standard. This is regulatory accumulation. It's a factor everywhere in all countries, but it looks like it's been out of control, especially with federal, provincial levels, the ping pong going back and forth, and then Indigenous nations have a right to be consulted. So why don't we, that's the bad news. Here's where we are. The great news is the future is bright, right? So why don't you take us out of this bleak picture that I've painted from London? You're on the ground in Calgary, right?
Well, I will pass on some positive news. I had a breakfast last week with 4 of the CEOs of some of Canada's biggest pension funds, and it was a breakfast with 100 100 or more people, but the CEOs were in conversation about their outlook on the Canadian economy and the global economy in general. And long term, even medium term, they're very bullish on where Canada is headed and its place in the global economy. We just have too much going for us. And they are encouraged by some of the recent attempts to streamline approvals processes, some of the focus on capital investment. And, they said things like, in the short term, there is some pain and there's some adjustment as we reduce and try to reduce regulatory burden while still coping with the different rights holders and stakeholders who have an interest in everything that's happening. But there's an adjustment that is happening, and there's a prime minister who, if he understands one thing, it's economic issues and foreign investment requirements. And so they were encouraged about our long-term prospects and our place in the world. They would like to see more. They would like to invest more in Canada themselves. So they're quite eager, and they were anticipating some of the budget moves. They're ready to open up their checkbooks again.
Good news, because for a long time they've just been primarily focused overseas. So that's really positive feedback. And coming back to Prime Minister Carney, he knows how to make money, right? He knows what you have to do to succeed. And, with his international background and experience, not only, Governor of Bank of Canada, Governor of the Bank of England, and the work that he's done globally, he knows the importance of competing. And to have a high level of compete is what Canada needs to succeed. So that's great. And 800 companies chose Canada last year, right? They decide to invest in Canada. So those are good numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the fine print in that budget that we'll comb over. But from an Indigenous economy perspective, I was encouraged to see quite a few things, actually. For example, our friends over at First Nations Finance Authority, Ernie Daniels and the gang have been working hard for a while to get a change to legislation that would allow FNFA to lend to special purpose vehicles. The way their governing legislation works at the moment, they're only permitted to lend directly to their members. If you recall, their members are First Nations who've been certified by the First Nations Financial Management Board. And so up to this point, FNFA is only permitted to lend directly to First Nations who are their members. But more and more with these projects, there are special purpose vehicles that are set up. And this change in legislation, which will now have to come, so the budget just announced that they will be tabling legislation to make this change, which will free up FNFA to lend directly to SPVs instead of having to circumvent and do indirectly finance projects. This will allow more projects to be financed by FNFA, who seem to have insatiable demand for their bonds. They just raised almost $500 million more a couple of weeks ago in the debt capital markets. They say they can raise more if the projects are there. And this change will allow them to lend to more projects, and it will allow First Nations who take advantage of this SPV route to not necessarily put their assets at risk. If they've got a government guarantee, then they won't have to put their assets at risk, and that'll be another feature, I think, of this change in legislation. Anyway, very encouraging, and I'm sure our FNFA friends are happy this morning to see that.
Yes, that is good news. And, it builds on the work, as you said, Ernie Daniels and his team have been doing over the past number of years now. We've been talking a bit about Canada and deficits, and it's a larger deficit. But when we look at our debt to GDP ratio in Canada, there's a lot of fiscal capacity because Canada at the federal level, the debt sits around 42% of GDP, right? Size of the economy. The US is 95 to 100, and every day they shut down. I'm sure that number is pushing up. How can you be out of business for 30 days? How can a country prosper in those situations? The UK is around 100%. And we all know the challenges the UK has. France is 110% plus. Italy's 140% plus, but coming down. Maloney seems to be doing a good job. And Japan's at 260% plus. So for all the challenges that Canada has, the great thing, going back a lot to, Prime Minister Chrétien and his finance minister, Paul Martin, and under the Stephen Harper Conservatives, there's a solid fiscal foundation in Canada. And now with Prime Minister Carney, as we've talked about his knowledge and experience, to build on that, he has the capacity to do things. So Canada has real borrowing capacity that peer countries simply don't have.
It's a great point, Mark. And I think that's part of the point that the CEOs at the breakfast of the pension funds were making, that, all of this is relative. We've got our issues, but other countries have bigger issues. And when you look around, I think Canada's in a great spot for a lot of reasons. I was reading a quote just this week from one of my old professors at Western, economics professor Peter Howitt, who just recently was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics this year.
Oh, fantastic. That was something, wasn't it?
It was great.
And you were one of his students. So hopefully some of this rubbed off on you, Rob.
I was one of his students. I'm a failed, frustrated business student, but I did economics at Western, and law was always a plan B for me.
That's okay. Okay, well, but aren't we lucky? And
but to quote Peter Howitt, and I'll read from what he said. They were asking him about how you think Canada is set up to absorb the fallout from the AI bubble that everybody thinks is a bubble, just don't know when it's going to burst. And he says Canada is particularly fortunate in having a conservative kind of financial system, which is quite sensibly regulated. It's generally thought amongst economists that Canada has the worst financial system of all until there's a financial crash. And then it's the best of them all. So I think Canada's probably going to do as well as anybody when that AI bubble crashes.
Wow. Great quote, and from a Nobel Prize winner, which I haven't heard of any big names from the U.S. winning a Nobel Prize. Certainly, if you're listening, Canada got that one, right? And of course, other advantages. Canada has political stability, which is increasingly rare around the world. And when you think of that, we have a parliamentary democracy plus a written constitution. So we have something very unique that other parliament democracies don't necessarily have. So I think that's important. Rule of law obviously functions due to people like you, Rob. We don't have too many lawyers, but we got enough to make sure the rule of law still functions. Canada has the most highly educated workforce in the G7. And of course, Canada is endowed with natural resources for energy, oil, gas, uranium, hydro, wind, solar potential, the Bay of Fundy off the East Coast. If we could ever crack that one, we'd be lighting up the eastern seaboard, right? Critical minerals for batteries and clean tech and supply chain and defense security, agriculture. The prairies are a breadbasket for the world. Fresh water. I think Canada has the largest reserves of fresh water around the world. We grow up with that. We don't really appreciate what that means. So Canada has so much going for it. So why don't we talk, Rob, about Carney's vision and what you've seen from the budget and how it comes back to the opportunity by working with Indigenous nations to make Canada that energy superpower.
Yeah, there's some other interesting initiatives aimed at the Indigenous economy. They're going to table legislation and I think a pilot project to help First Nations contractors get bonded. So at the moment, there's a problem under the Indian Act with First Nations businesses and people using collateral, using assets on reserve for collateral. And if you're a construction company or contractor and you want to get bonded, as you have to do for these big jobs, but you can't use your collateral, your assets that you've got on reserve, you can imagine how that,
Crazy.
yeah, how that restricts you. So there's a proposal. Again, I think this is something that FNFA have been pushing for a while, but to take money, and I think they're going to do a pilot project, sell a bond in the market, and then use that money to fund different First Nations contractors to make it easier for them to get bonded, to compete for construction projects. Procurement is a huge opportunity when you talk about defense and all the procurement possibilities that are coming there. If you're a First Nations business and you want to participate in that, you'll need to get bonded, and this program hopefully will help make that easier to do.
Well, it has to. How can you compete when you can't get bonded? And you can't get bonded because of the Indian Act, if that's not tying your hands behind your back. The Inuit now, luckily, weren't covered by the Indian Act. Okay, I think it was too cold and most people just didn't think about it. So they're ready and set to go for opportunities in the Arctic, but you have Canada going to have 12 submarines. We haven't had that many, I think, in history. And certainly, I'm not even sure if the Canadian Navy has 12 ships today. But at the end of the World War, we had World War II, we had the third largest Navy in the world. And for that contract of 12 submarines, and they're diesel, not nuclear, we are talking, Canada is talking to German shipyards. So Prime Minister Carney was visiting there. And when he was he was talking to the South Koreans who have a very strong shipbuilding program. So both those countries and those companies in those countries will be looking, how do we succeed with Indigenous nations to help win those contracts? Because that will be very important. And I think sometimes when you're coming from outside of Canada, you have a greater respect for the cultural differences when you're dealing with the Indigenous peoples of Canada, because you expect them to be different. Whereas sometimes Canadians think, oh, well, we're all in Canada, we all like the same things, and don't really think through what it means to be an Indigenous Canadian and the barriers. So hopefully that bond issue gets settled right away.
Yeah, absolutely. That's encouraging, and I'll have to see the details. There's another initiative to allow First Nations to monetize their transfer payments that they would get on an annual basis from the federal government to run those programs and to make investments in particular on their reserves. So this is a new initiative in the budget as well.
Excellent.
And so that again will allow First Nations to secure effectively those future revenues that they're going to be getting transfers from the federal government, but use them today to make investments. These are long-term capital investments. So that's encouraging. There's reference to establishing some tax jurisdiction frameworks with more First Nations. So I think that's hinting at wanting more to provide more taxing authorities to Indigenous communities to raise their own revenues and give them taxing authorities. There's, for example, a resource charge that's been talked about. I don't think that's mentioned in this budget, but that's one of the possibilities when you talk about establishing tax jurisdiction frameworks, which would allow Indigenous people to tax more directly some of the projects in their territories. There's a housing Build Canada Homes initiative, which is going to include Indigenous housing as part of that. So all of that is encouraging.
It is. So when you look at Canada, fiscal room, resources, and stability. And the clarity now that the Indigenous peoples of Canada, through the Supreme Court, what's in the Constitution, UNDRIP, there's that stability, whereas in the past it hasn't been clear, right? Now it is. The Indigenous peoples are your partners. They are rights holders. That's how to achieve things. The old way doesn't work anymore. So you have a clear vision. And again, we've heard from many of our guests on podcasts, when you work with the Indigenous peoples to make your project succeed, you have long-term commitment, because they're not looking, how do I make a buck today? They're thinking 7 generations ahead. And they know how to get things done because it's their land. And they've navigated the bureaucracy that's been imposed on them, unfortunately, successfully. So they know how to play it.
Yeah, there's talk. There's a bit of fleshing out of the the major projects office, and a couple $100 million allocated to that, and also the Indigenous Advisory Council, which will advise that office and make sure Indigenous equity participation and other Indigenous meaningful Indigenous participation is a part of all of these projects. That's reinforced in this budget as well. So that all is encouraging. I like the talk of the Arctic Infrastructure Fund. There's a critical minerals sovereign wealth fund that's being established. We've seen a real life example just recently with a graphite miner being funded by the Canadian government. Effectively, the government has signed an offtake agreement guaranteeing a minimum price for the graphite.
That's excellent. That's a first in a long time.
Yeah, and I think this critical minerals sovereign wealth fund is going to make more investments like that to allow, that should allow this miner to get funded and ensure the economics work. And then the federal government is going to try to get other countries signed up to this critical minerals sovereign wealth fund. And that's all to, battle the might of China in this space and take some of that power back.
And the insecurity of the US, right?
Mm-hmm.
Canada remains your preferred North American partner. We've always been loyal.
Yeah.
So with all those great assets, including its people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, it's a place to come and do business in. I'm sure that's the message Prime Minister Carney is out there pushing, and he has the reputation to deliver that. What about the initial feedback, Rob, from, I know it's only morning and you may have been to the breakfast already. Okay. But what's the initial feedback from, people you've been speaking with, after the budget? And
well, literally got off the plane while the budget was being announced, and have been sleeping. I have not been to the breakfast yet, so I don't know what others are thinking. I mentioned Goldie Hyder, who is also here, would have liked to have seen more Indigenous reaction. I think there's the encouraging things that I see. There's also the 2% cut to Indigenous Services Canada and Indigenous Relations. All government departments are going to have to work with less people and less money, and that's going to hit some of the programs. And so when you're already talking about being behind, and there being gaps when it comes to Indigenous infrastructure and services, having to work with even less money going forward and fewer people, that's going to be a big challenge. And AI won't magically solve all productivity issues overnight. That's a period of adjustment.
yes. And I think, I was surprised when I read that about Indigenous services being cut back, and understand, share the pain across all departments. But Indigenous services is not just like all departments, because the people it's serving aren't treated equally, and there's still barriers, just as we're talking about, how to get a bond when you're on a reserve, right? So that was a surprising move, but hopefully some of these other areas will give the compensation, because I think some of the most competitive businesses today are Indigenous led and run, and we've spoken to some of these guys, and they're hungry. So if Canada becomes an even more welcoming business environment, they're going to be fighting for their share of that, and they've had to compete because they've had so many restrictions. You've had so many restrictions placed on you.
Yeah, I think they're trying to lay the groundwork. If it's not as transformative as people would have hoped, I think they are trying to lay groundwork for private capital to come in within Canada and outside of Canada. There's some tax deductions and some other initiatives that will make it cheaper to do business in Canada, which will be attractive. They're trying to reduce the regulatory burden. They were outwardly, beyond North America, very focused on those places for capital, and they're trying to encourage more meaningful Indigenous participation and economic development. It will be transformative if the private sector, private investors take advantage of these initiatives.
Yes, and Canada depends on the private sector. If it's led, our wealth is dependent on private enterprise saying this is a good place to invest, and it looks like they're making Canada more attractive in the global competition for capital, whether it's money or brains. Canada's back open for business is what I like to think about. Now, Carney also talked when he was in Asia about Canada being an energy superpower, and it's mentioned that time and time again, and that's true. And I think there's 40 billion available through crown corporations for major energy and infrastructure projects, right? You've talked about some of the tax changes and investment incentives aimed at unlocking $1 trillion in total investment over the next 5 years, which is what they're looking for. And this is mostly private money. The government can only go so far. So let's come back to the vision for Canada. Reduce reliance on the US amid the trade war. And even if the trade war ends tomorrow, Canadians are not going back to the way it was. There's a big discussion about a nuclear energy deal with Westinghouse and Cameco. And a lot of people are saying, well, why aren't we using CANDU, Canadian nuclear technology? Why are we partnering with that? Do we really want to be dependent on the Americans for our nuclear reactors? So that will continue. Canada is a stable energy and critical minerals partner for all nations around the world. Canada will continue to position itself as a leader in clean energy and the clean energy economy. And the infrastructure is being put in place to grow the economy faster than the debt. And I think everybody's up for the challenge. Canada is one of the top 5 globally in oil, uranium, hydro, and natural gas. We've talked about wind and solar. Okay, we have traditional energy and clean energy. And you mentioned about critical minerals. So I think we're in a very, very strong place going forward. And it might not be as transformative as we thought, but Canada is certainly becoming more investable, right? Let's bring this home.
Absolutely, Mark. Yeah, one step at a time, but we are moving in the right direction, and I'm encouraged.
Yes, record FDI in the past year, even with all the mess, right? Canada record FDI in 2024. So Canada is transforming. This is a real change. I think it's important to mention at this point in time, because we've covered a lot today, Rob. It's been great to catch up with you, even before breakfast in Calgary. Okay, I skipped lunch for this podcast. Okay, so we're both kind of looking for some energy, but the conversation itself has been very energetic, and as we're coming into November now, it's Remembrance Day. As our viewers can see, we have our poppies on. Canada was formed the Canada, what we as Canadians call Canada today, Vimy Ridge in World War I and World War II were defining moments for Canada as it stood on its path. But the history of Canada has been fought for by the Indigenous peoples of Canada from the get-go. That's where our relationship came from, fighting together to be free, not to be ruled by a dictator in Washington, which has proven itself in recent times. And in World War I, even with the constraints that the Indigenous peoples had, they were out there fighting for the country.
Yeah, on a per
Canada.
capita basis, sacrificed more than any other group of people, and all on a volunteer basis. So it is an important week to remember all of our service people and all of those who especially gave their lives. And we also remember Murray Sinclair this week, who passed away 1 year ago.
What a huge loss for Canada, as well as the Indigenous peoples of Canada, because Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
I've said this many times, but one of those rare individuals who, when I heard him speak, I stopped whatever I was doing to listen and listen intently. So we remember him this week, and Indigenous Veterans Day coming up. We remember especially all those Indigenous veterans, and also Remembrance Sunday and Remembrance Day. A very special week. We shall remember them.
And just for some of our viewers who didn't know you in the UK, and I think many of them did, our viewers and listeners, can you talk a little bit about the Maple Leaf Trust over here in the UK and its work?
Maple Leaf Trust was set up after World War II to help Canadian veterans and their families who were settling in the UK and weren't returning to Canada, and fell between the cracks of government support because they weren't in Canada, or they were in the UK, but they weren't Brits. And so this charity was set up to help support those veterans and families. It still exists today. We still have three spouses, three veterans on our books, not all from World War II. We still actually have a spouse whose husband fought for the Brits in World War I and for Canada in World War II, you can imagine. And the Maple Leaf Trust also does many other things. Today it funds many scholarships for Canadians studying in the UK. We're also associated with the Terry Fox Foundation and help raise money for cancer research, led by a Canadian professor in London. And so many great initiatives, as well as just honoring veterans in different ways.
So special time, a time to remember all those who went before us. So thank you, Rob. Great to catch up. Look forward to seeing you next week on our podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mark. It's great talking to you.
Enjoy Calgary.
Thanks.
May they win a game. Thank you for joining Rob and I today in a special podcast where we discussed an issue of critical importance for our listeners and viewers. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time. Mark your calendars for the upcoming 2026 Summit, taking place on the 8th of April. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.